Part 2 is going to do the fan brush and the bright. In part 1, we did the round and the flat. Now the flat, the use of the thick lines would be for your background or anything like that where you have to fill in a lot of space. And obviously if it's a lot of space, you want to use a bigger brush than this or the small one that you're probably using right now. Fan is great for texture and hair. Anything that has thin lines, even grass too, is real. You can use the fan brush for grass and texture, anything like that. Now you wet the fan brushes, bristle, load up the paint. Now when you're loading up the paint on the fan brush, make sure that you turn the fan brush and get every bristle. Okay, so that way it makes all the lines. The other thing you need to remember when you're using the fan brush is not to press hard. And make sure the bristles are separate. A good idea before you start putting it in the palette is to run your finger over the top so that all the bristles are separated. Now I'm going to press very lightly. If you go over the words, that's okay. You want to see individual lines. Now you see how there's not much paint left? You could flip the paintbrush over, and if you're still not getting a lot of paint, load it up with paint again. These bristles are really thin, so they're going to use the paint faster. Okay? You can do it a couple of times if you want. So make sure it looks like that. You will know that you're pressing too hard if it looks like this. Look at that. Now if this happens, put more water in the brush. Now watch what happens. If you just see a blob of thickness like this, that means you either have too much water in your brush for watercolors or too much paint when we start doing tempera. So make sure, if it looks like this, kind of go up here, and you can use your paper towel to separate the bristles so that each individual one looks like that. And look at the difference. You want it to look like hair. You want it to have that texture. Now for clouds, add a tiny bit of water. Push the brush, against the water glass so that you drain the excess water. Load up your paintbrush as you turn it. Now you're going to do it in an arc. Watch. Now if you get a blob of paint, all you have to do is take your paper towel and kind of dab at it so that it doesn't leak everywhere. The key to doing good clouds with the fan brush is to attach them and do layers of them. Like one on top, one underneath, one above, anything like that. And you could change the color, you can add blue, orange, anything like that. But this way you have your two lines. You have this one, this is how you make your texture, and then that one, that's how you make the clouds. Okay? Just a reminder, when you're rinsing off the brushes over here, make sure you rinse them off good. You don't want to stain the brushes. Also, if your water, if you notice, my water is orange right now, an orange red. If it starts to get black, make sure you go to the sink and rinse it out, or your the color of the water is going to start to bleed it into your paint. So make sure you rinse it out if it starts to turn black or very dark. Now we're going to the bright. What close painting means is that you can paint very close to the paper with these types of brushes. The other brushes, a technique is to hold it at a distance. That's why it has a long handle. You can paint it like this and not have your wrist rest against the paint because the paint will be wet. The bright brush is meant to be painted closer. Also, it's really good for blending because if you notice, it's thick on the bottom and thin on the top. The paint starts to load up down here. You'll see this when we do temperas. It loads up down here, and then you have maybe a light gray here. And it's a lot easier to blend with a bright. We'll talk about that later on. You're doing 2 lines with this, the same way as the flat. This way. From one side to the other. Then you're going to turn it this way. You probably noticed that I keep going like this on the side of my palette. That's so I can kind of drain the excess water so I don't get a blob. Especially on this paper. This paper is really thin. Okay, we're going to be using watercolor when we actually paint, watercolor paper. But right now we're just using this because it's just a demo. See the thin line? It's a lot straighter than this thin line. The reason is because it's thin on the top, so it's a little easier to make the thin lines. Okay, so now we're done with our fan brush, bright brush. I'm going to get my pointed brush again, and I'm going to paint my name. You see how I'm turning the brush as I dip it in the palette. Got our point. Now I'm going to paint my name as thin as I possibly can. This is what you're going to be doing. I guess this gives you some practice. With pressing lightly to make a thin line. Try to make this as thin as you possibly can. And don't forget to put your period number. Okay? When you're done, put this on the drying rack. And at the end of class, put it in the completed bin. Okay? We're done.